Congress and the Federalist, Lecture 3. We're still talking about Federalist 62, which is about the Senate. I had finished the previous lecture talking about the fact that in comparison to the House, the Senate was going to be smaller in terms of membership. Its members would serve for longer terms, and since re-election is staggered, the membership is going to be a lot more stable because not all of the Senate is up for re-election at any one time. Now we talk about why these things are meant to remedy certain defects of what he calls popular legislatures. Now, by a popular legislature, he means one that is directly accountable to the people. And he has the point of comparison he has is he's thinking about what it would be like if you had just a single legislature, just one assembly elected by the people that passes legislation. So instead of having two layers, instead of having a House and a Senate, he's basically saying, like, what would it be like if you just had a House, just the House of Representatives? And one of the things he notes is that directly representative legislatures, such as what you have in the House, they tend to be really big, right? They tend to be big and they tend to serve for short terms. And both the size and the shortness of the terms can lead to some very serious problems. So he begins, and this is on page 376, by saying, in the first place, the defense for having a Senate is, again, this idea of legislative balances and checks. He basically says, look, it is possible, even a popularly elected legislature can grow corrupt. Right? There's no absolute guarantee against corruption. The benefit of bicameralism is, should it be the case that the House becomes corrupt, that doesn't necessarily mean you have a corrupt legislature, because the House can't do anything on its own. So if the House grows corrupt, the Senate's not going to go along with what the House says. So in order to corrupt your legislature, you would actually have to find a way to corrupt both the House and the Senate at the same time. So there, just the argument is just simple bicameralism means that it will be harder for a government to grow corrupt, because two quite different chambers would have to be corrupted at the same time. Then he goes on to some specific weaknesses of popular legislatures on page 377. Right? As he says, the necessity of a Senate is not less indicated by the propensity of all single and numerous assemblies to yield to the impulse of sudden and violent passions and to be seduced by factious leaders into intemperate and pernicious resolutions. So in other words, large popular assemblies and popular assemblies in general can be not as reasonable. I think everybody knows that large groups of people oftentimes get more worked up than individuals, right? People are, for the most part, way more likely to yell and scream and shout and jump around like in a stadium full of other sports fans than just sitting on their couch. I mean, I know people can still scream and shout and stuff like that, but when people are in groups, passions become infectious. People get excited, people get worked up. They get carried away in a way that they don't when they're kind of like sitting quietly with just a few other people. So large assemblies, can have that effect where people start, get feeding on emotion and they get worked up and they're not calm anymore. The way that groups can kind of become mobs when they get worked up. And you don't want that in a legislature. You don't want people legislating in a fit of passion of some kind or another. So you've got that problem. And also, the fact that large groups can be subject to manipulation by good speakers. I mean, when you have a really large group, a lot of times what happens is not that each individual makes a small contribution, but rather that it ends up dividing up into kind of groups, each of whom, is sort of behind a particular speaker. So what you actually have in a numerous assembly sometimes is, like 3 or 4 orators or demagogues who are the influential ones, and then most of the rest of the legislature kind of aligns itself with one or the other of those demagogues. So there's actually a way in which a large legislature is more subject to manipulation in that regard, because if somebody's a really crafty, really good orator, really good speaker, can assert quite a bit of dominance over a large group. Whereas, when you have a relatively small number of people sitting around, it's a lot harder to use oratorical and rhetorical tricks to get people to go along with you and to work them up. So that's why, as he says, all that need be remarked is that a body which is to correct this infirmity ought itself to be free from it, and consequently ought to be less numerous, so less of a crowd, so you don't get that crowd psychology effect. It ought, moreover, to possess great firmness, that is, ability to make a resolution and stick to it and not be blown about by the popular passions and stuff like that. And consequently ought to hold its authority by a tenure of considerable duration. That's an important thing to note because we'll see this with the executive too. This idea that the longer your term is, the longer you are insulated from public opinion, which in some ways can be a good thing, because if you've formulated a judgment about how you think things should be, then at that point you need to make the decision, you need to act on it. You can't be constantly worrying about and revising what you're saying and doing in light of how it's going over with the public. You need a certain amount of firmness so that you're not just slavishly tied to every shift in public opinion. And so the way you get that firmness is by having a long term. So you can say to yourself, like, look, I don't even have to stand for re-election for like 4 more years. So here's this thing that I think we should do. I think this treaty is a good idea, for example. It's not going to be very popular, but, hopefully we'll do it. And people will realize after the fact, or people will realize over time that actually this was a good idea. So that by the time I'm standing for re-election, it's not going to be held against me anymore because people have had the time to see, oh, he was right about that. That was a good decision. I'm glad he stood firm on that instead of going with public opinion. And so the Senate can do that much more because the House is going to be very close to public opinion because no member of the House is ever more than 2 years away from having to stand for re-election. So they have to look like they're always in touch. The Senate doesn't have to worry quite so much about looking like they're always in touch. They have a little bit more freedom, a little bit more insulation to act as a trustee as opposed to a delegate. So then the third defect, which the Senate is meant to correct, he says, another defect of a popular assembly to be supplied by the Senate lies in a want of due acquaintance with the objects and principles of legislation. In other words, popular legislatures at this time, and they expected this for the future, would have a large number of kind of naive and inexperienced members. As he says, it is not possible that an assembly of men called for the most part from pursuits of a private nature, continued in appointment for a short time, and led by no permanent motive to devote the intervals of public occupation to the study of the laws, the affairs, and the comprehensive interests of the country, should, if left wholly to themselves, escape a variety of important errors in the exercise of their legislative trust. Now, that's quite a sentence there, but what he means by that is you expect a lot of amateurs. A lot of people are going to be elected to the House are people who are not professional politicians. They might be lawyers, they might be merchants. They've got some other life, and so they don't necessarily have extensive experience with drafting laws, deliberating about laws, thinking about all the different things that have got to go into it. They're going to be inexperienced. And obviously, if they're inexperienced, they're not necessarily going to make good laws all the time. Because they just, that takes time and it takes experience. Lawmaking is difficult and it requires learning from experience. And so his argument is you need to compensate for that inexperience. And the way you do it is through the Senate, because you don't want to give members of the House super long terms. You need your legislature to be in touch with the people, in touch with public opinion, because that's important data to take into consideration in making legislation. It's just that you need more from your legislature than simply being in touch with public opinion. You need a kind of capacity to deliberate, to sift, and to filter public opinion in order to make good laws. And your naive and inexperienced legislators are not necessarily going to be able to do that. In the House, that's kind of okay if you have a second chamber which can correct for that. So the expectation was, look, the House of Representatives, because of its short terms and all that kind of stuff, you're going to have a constant churn of new members, many of whom really have very little direct experience legislating. So they're not always going to produce the highest quality legislation. And that's fine, because then on the other hand, you have the Senate. And in the Senate, not only are you dealing with people who are older, right, on average, and so they probably have more experience than your average member of the House. But even beyond that, they have longer terms in office, so they have a longer time to learn how to do what they're doing, right? So they have room to, well, first of all, they are more likely to bring with them to the office prior experience, since you have to be older to be in the Senate. And they have more time in office to learn the ropes, so to speak, and gain that experience. It's as he says in the first full paragraph on page 378. A good government implies two things. First, fidelity to the object of government, which is the happiness of the people. Right? So you want the happiness of the people. Secondly, a knowledge of the means by which that object can best be attained. Right? So again, like what Madison said before, it's not just enough to want the public good. It's not just enough to have good intentions. You've also got to be intelligent. You've got to know how to bring about the public good. And as he says, some governments are deficient in both these qualities. North Korea. Most governments are deficient in the first, right, fidelity to the happiness of the people, because at the time he's writing, it's primarily aristocracies and monarchies. I scruple not to assert that in American governments, too little attention has been paid to the last, namely the knowledge, the knowledgeableness. So he kind of argues that there's been insufficient concern in the United States for making sure that our legislators are actually good at their jobs. And so the Senate's more likely to be good at their job, and so that's going to help. So the Senate is there as a check on corruption. That's the first thing. The Senate will be a smaller, they thought more cool-headed body, so it will correct the House's tendency to perhaps go with what's popular, to get worked up and go with what's popular without thinking sufficiently about the legislation. And also, whereas the House is expected to always have a kind of a certain number of naive and inexperienced legislators, this is to be corrected by the Senate, where your average senator is going to have and gain more experience and knowledge. And then the last thing that he turns to, I can't remember if I keep saying Hamilton, but this is a paper by Madison. So if I've been saying Hamilton, I apologize. It's Madison. But the fourth point, which he talks about on pages 378 through 80, and he divides it up into subsections, has to do with another problem with popular legislatures, which is that they have a high degree of what he calls instability and mutability. Mutability means changeableness. And what he means by this is with the House, since government by consent requires election and safety in government requires frequent election, then they expected the House to have a lot of churn, that there'd be a lot of turnover in membership. And because there are elections every 2 years, some of that turnover could be pretty significant. And when membership in the legislature changes, more than just the membership changes, because when people come to office, if people run for office and want to come to office, it's usually because they want to do something. Maybe they want to repeal something that is there that they don't think is good. Maybe they want to make a new law about something where there hasn't been a law before. Or maybe they want to alter existing laws. But one way or another, when people run for office and get themselves elected, they usually want to change something. And so if every 2 years you're getting a flood of people wanting to change something, then you're going to have very changeable and unstable laws. That either because existing laws will be constantly being altered or being repealed, or because you have new laws being made by these new members. But one way or another, Madison argues having instability or mutability in the laws is actually really bad, especially for average citizens. That for the most part, you actually want lawmaking to be, not rare, but you want it to happen slowly. You don't want too much of it. And he gives several examples in pages 378, 379, and then 380 about the bad consequences of having frequently changing laws. In the first place, as he points out, frequent changes in law and policy do not inspire much confidence in other countries, right? Because other countries will look at the United States and be like, wow, they make major policy changes every couple years. So who knows what their priorities are going to be 2 years from now. So why would we want to make an alliance with them? Why would we want to sign a treaty with them? Because even if they're thinking and saying one thing today, the public opinion and policies change so frequently that what this group of representatives tells us today about what America's priorities are, it could be totally different by 2 years from now. So, on the one hand, for the sake of good relations with foreign countries, we want foreign countries to see the policy of the United States as stable and reliable. And so that's where, the Senate comes in, because even if you have a lot of turnover in the House, and even rapid turnover in the House because of elections every 2 years, that's not going to be the case in the Senate. In the Senate, you'll have much less turnover. When you have less turnover, that means in any given election, you're going to have fewer people storming into the Senate wanting to change things, because you're going to have, 2/3 of the Senate going to be people that were there in the previous session, and they're not necessarily going to be eager to change their own work. So the Senate is going to kind of pump the brakes on frequent legislation. Now, as he goes on to say, there are other problems too. It actually having frequent new laws and frequent changing laws are actually really bad for ordinary citizens too. There's a paragraph in the middle of page 379 where he says the internal effects. So in other words, not our relations with foreign countries, but in domestic politics, the internal effects of mutable policy, constantly changing policy, are still more calamitous. It poisons the blessings of liberty itself. It will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice, if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood, if they be repealed or revised before they are promulgated, or undergo such incessant changes that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it will be tomorrow. Law is defined to be a rule of action, but how can that be a rule which is little known and less fixed? So in other words, if the laws are constantly changing, that's bad for ordinary citizens, because, they can't plan for the future. They might know what the law is today, but who knows what it's going to be tomorrow, right? Or if you have constant laws being made, you end up with, such a huge law code that no citizen can actually know what all the laws are. Kind of one of those, I forget what the website is. I think it might be the Cato Institute, but there's a kind of funny feature on, I think it's one of those, a libertarian think tank, where it kind of goes through the entire, kind of code of federal laws and points out that pretty much every American probably breaks at least one federal law every day, because there are just so many of them, it's almost impossible to live a normal life without running athwart of one of them. That's the kind of thing that Madison's getting at. And it's actually with the effect that Madison would foresee, which is, most Americans don't even bother to know what most of the federal laws are. There are so many. Who knows? And to a certain extent, a lot of them, they don't necessarily directly affect our lives, but we just think, well, there's really no reason to pay attention to this. There's so many of them. And Madison would say that's kind of a problem, when you have so many laws that people don't even try to keep track of them all in order to stay on the right side of them. And he also goes on to say, though, that it's not only the case that, it's that constantly changing laws means you don't really have rule of law, but also that a constantly busy legislature actually are the perfect condition for wealthy, well-connected members of society to manipulate the laws. So a really busy legislature actually makes it easier for already powerful interests to manipulate the government. Here's how he puts it, page 379. Another effect of public instability is the unreasonable advantage it gives to the sagacious, that is, the clever, the enterprising, and the moneyed few over the industrious and uninformed mass of the people. So, in other words, a constantly busy and changing lawmaking and public policy process is really good for elites, but not good for ordinary citizens. As he says, every new regulation concerning commerce or revenue, or in any manner affecting the value of different species of property, presents a new harvest to those who watch the change and can trace its consequences. A harvest reared not by themselves, but by the toils and cares of the great body of their fellow citizens. This is a state of things in which it may be said with some truth that the laws are made for the few and not for the many. Right. So in other words, when Congress is contemplating a new tax law, most ordinary citizens don't keep up with that, can't afford to hire a lobbyist. They don't have people in Washington trying to make sure that the law is written in a way that favors their interest. Um, but the enterprising and wealthy few, to put it in somewhat anachronistic language, they can hire lobbyists. They do have the resources to keep up with what Congress is doing. And when there's some piece of legislation being proposed and they think, oh, if we tweak it this way, if we get a loophole for this or whatever, then that's going to be really great for us because we'll get a tax break or we'll get a subsidy or whatever. Those who are already wealthy and powerful can use their wealth and their power to manipulate the legislative process to make them even wealthier and more powerful. Whereas ordinary citizens are out in the cold. I don't know about you, but I don't have a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. that's constantly looking out for my interests and interceding with Congress. And most citizens aren't. So Madison's point is that a busy legislature is a legislature that is leaving itself ripe for and open for elite manipulation. Whereas, a less busy, a more stable legislature creates fewer opportunities for the wealthy and well-connected to try to get the laws changed in a way that favors their interests. Okay, so that's another problem. And I think that is really enough to, there are other, it even goes on in Federalist Paper 63 to talk about other problems with mutable policy. But he ends 62 with a general reflection that this kind of constantly changing policy landscape over time tends to sap people's confidence in their own form of government. As he says in the last paragraph of Federalist 62 on page 380. But the most deplorable effect of all is that diminution of attachment and reverence which steals into the hearts of the people towards a political system which betrays so many marks of infirmity and disappoints so many of their flattering hopes. No government, any more than an individual, will long be respected without being truly respectable, nor be truly respectable without possessing a certain portion of order and stability. So in other words, a constantly busy legislature will over time prove a great disappointment to the people. They will not have the same respect for the law because they will not have respect for the institution that makes the law, because that institution is constantly showing itself to be incompetent, changing its mind, changing course, doing something, then undoing it, changing it. And in general, just because it is not orderly and stable, it will not inspire the respect of the people. And that can only harm Congress. So the Senate is there, again, to protect against that instability, because the long terms and the fact that they're staggered so that you don't have so much turnover in personnel from election to election means that whereas the House will oftentimes be impelled to be doing new things, the Senate will move much more slowly and much more cautiously, because it just won't have the same flood of regular flood of new members trying to change things. Now, just let me end with one reflection, which is that this is not exactly really how it works anymore. The main reason being that both members of the Senate and members of the House tend to have very high reelection rates. But so what we've ended up with is might actually seem somewhat paradoxical from the perspective of Federalist 62, which is that both the House and the Senate actually, in comparison to what was expected in the 1790s, both the House and the Senate have very stable membership. I mean, the reelection rate for like in the House of Representatives, if you are an incumbent, that is, if you hold office in the House of Representatives and you decide to run for reelection, your chances of being reelected are over 90%. So the House has, if anything, even more stability than the founders had or framers had originally expected of the Senate. So we have very stable membership in Congress, but on the other hand, we also have these voluminous and mutable laws. So in other words, the thing that stability is supposed to prevent, namely constant legislation, new laws, old laws being undone, old laws being altered. So it's kind of constant change in the rules. So stability was supposed to be a remedy against that. You keep the membership stable, and that will keep stable the output. But instead, we have extremely stable membership, but we also have the mutability that Madison is concerned about. And that includes things like having lots of special interests and lobbyists who are able to manipulate this legislative process to carve out exemptions and loopholes and benefits for themselves. So in that sense, stability turns out to be not enough to save us. But I just go through this because this is to help you see why there is a Senate. I mean, I think sometimes people just, because it's what we're used to, you just got to think, well, of course, there's the House and the Senate. There are two chambers. But in this one, it really kind of lays out the case for why the Senate, why the framers arranged the Senate the way they did, why the long terms, why the higher qualifications, why the staggered elections, why so small, and so on. So now you can see why. And it's essentially because the Senate is there to improve the capacity of Congress to deliberate well about legislation and not be misled by demagogues and temporary popular passions and things like that. But although the Senate provides these correctives, it's still the case that you need the House. As I said at the beginning, the House and the Senate kind of counterbalance each other, because if you only have the Senate, it would be very stable, but it would also start to look a lot like an aristocracy because it's so distant from immediate public opinion since weren't even directly elected. So if you had the House on its own, you would probably have a kind of raucous, busy, constantly changing, and therefore naive and inexpert and manipulable assembly. If you just had the House on its own. If you just had the Senate on its own, you'd basically have something like an oligarchy. But when you put the two together, they correct one another. So the House is very in touch with the people. Public opinion sweeps through the House very quickly because you have to stand for re-election so frequently. You cannot afford to look out of touch. So the House, is meant to kind of gather up a lot of data. Like here are the interests, here are the concerns of our constituents, here are the things people want us to do. So the House kind of brings that to the table, and the Senate sort of brings a kind of filter. It sort of cools things down, like, okay, that's a popular idea, but let's think through this a little bit before we vote on it. And senators can do that because they won't necessarily bear immediate electoral consequences if they decide not to go along with public opinion. So the House and the Senate, with the House without the Senate without the House would be an inferior legislature. But you put the two together, and that way you can put popularity together with deliberateness by kind of this functional separation. Sort of the House supplies some qualities, the Senate supplies others, and no bill can become a law unless both of those can cooperate. And so that's the vision of Congress. In the next series of lectures, I'm going to talk about the office of the president in the original Constitution and move on to the very famous Federalist Paper 70 by Alexander Hamilton.